We are thrilled to have Greg Kahn join us live from the gallery. I am actually sitting in the back office and he is in the gallery space so that we can speak with you without wearing masks. And this is on the occasion of his exhibition, Havana Youth. Greg is an American documentary fine art photographer who grew up in a small coastal town in Rhode Island and attended the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. In August of 2012, he co-founded Grain, a photography collective. Greg's work concentrates on issues that shape personal and cultural identity, of which Havana Youth is absolutely one. Greg is a Pulitzer Prize finalist for feature photography with a 2011 project, It's Not a House, It's a Home, and where he explores the foreclosure crisis in Florida that defined a new class of homelessness. I understand from Nikisha that there are very many budding photographers with us today. So I thought, Greg, maybe you can start by telling us how you came to photography and how your career has evolved to the place it has today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. My interest in photography started in high school. I was in high school in Rhode Island, and I basically had picked up a camera, and it's one of those old, this is going to date myself, it's one of these old cameras that had a little flash cube on top, and you only could take like 4 or 5 pictures per cube, and then the cube would get exceedingly hot and burn your fingers, and you have to take it off and put a new one on. And I remember my pictures were just awful. I think I was trying to take a picture of my mom, and half her face was in frame and half her face was out of frame. And it was about as worst start as you could have in the photography business. But I enjoyed it. There was something about it that struck me. So what happened was in high school, I eventually upgraded to a first film camera. I went to my local paper and I told them I'd be interested in taking on any sort of assignments for them. And this was just, a twice weekly small coastal newspaper in Rhode Island. And they offered to pay me $20 per shoot. And so I would go out, and it ended up being a lot of high school sports. And since I was already in high school, it was a pretty easy transition. I played soccer. So the one sport that I wanted to photograph, I couldn't because I was playing, and I would pretty much photograph everything else. And it just kind of became something that I really started enjoying. And I branched out from that world of sports, and I started doing a lot of nature stuff. And then I applied my senior year to become, to go and attend the North American Nature Photography Association's annual summit in San Diego. And I really honestly did it because it would take me out of school for a week. So I was selected. I was, had my plane ticket paid for and went all the way out to San Diego for the week and got to study under National Geographic photographers. And I would say that was the moment that for sure, that was it. I knew what I wanted to do with my life. So kind of from that point on, I knew I wanted to go to school, and I knew I wanted to go to college for photography. Visual communications was something that I was interested in, and that kind of encompassed photography and different forms of artistic expression. So I did that. I went to George Washington University, continued with the photography passion that I had, graduated, ran out of money and had to move home, went back to working for the local paper, spent a year doing that. And then I took a workshop that I was coached by one of the, national newspaper photographers. And I spent 1 week doing one story, which I'd never done before. And out of that, it was a week in Kentucky. And coming out of that, I had a portfolio that I then got my first newspaper job with. So it was something that it just kind of was a slow progression. And I always knew what I wanted to be doing. It was just kind of different avenues to find my way there. So after I got in one newspaper, I worked in North Carolina for 2 years. And then using the photographs that I took there, I applied for a newspaper job in Florida, and I spent 5 years in Florida. So after Florida, I decided to go freelance, and I moved to Washington, D.C. And here I am, spending the last 6-7 years now.
Wow, it's quite a story. It's amazing how you kind of jump around to different places in the country. And I'm sure that the exposure to sort of different areas is, it must have had some sort of influence on your desire to seek, different cultures to sort of elevate and bring their voices to the fore, as you have in many projects.
Yeah, I mean, I was always kind of lucky. I played so much soccer that I was constantly traveling for different tournaments. So I found myself, constantly going to different, anywhere from up in New England down to Florida at an early age. And so that to me was kind of like part of my life experience, and it made me really love traveling. So that's something that I kept doing, and photography kind of became a way to further investigate places that I went.
Well, to that end, eventually it brought you to Havana.
Yeah.
So maybe we can speak a little bit about how you arrived at this project and how it sort of grew once you knew you wanted to capture the Cuban culture.
So specifically, it really started at the newspaper job in Florida that I had. Um, the community that I was involved with there had a large Cuban population, and I got to talk to a lot of them and hear a lot of the stories about their time and growing up in Cuba, and different facets of life there and how it contrasted with their life here. And so I had actually found a really interesting story about these parents who lived in Florida, who were going to be going back to Cuba to visit an ailing grandparent. And they were going to bring their son, who was an adult. He was getting married, and he was using the opportunity to use it as his bachelor party. And I thought that was really interesting because the son had never been to Cuba. And so there was this huge disconnect between the older generation and the younger generation on what Cuba was viewed as. For the parents, it was this place where family and home was. And for the son who was Cuban but had never been, it was a place that he saw as a vacation to party, to have a good time. So I pitched this to the newspaper, and the editor said, well, it's not local enough. It doesn't connect to our community enough. But by that point, I had already done all the research. I had done everything that to really make myself interested in going there. So when I did go freelance, that was kind of the first ticket that I booked. And going freelance is a whole interesting thing because now I'm on my own. I don't have a steady paycheck. I'm just kind of coming up with my own way of trying to make money. So before leaving, I'd saved up a lot of money in advance because I knew it was going to be rough to start, but I poured that money into this project at the beginning. So this was something that was in my soul to do. And so I paid my own way down there and started working on the project in its infancy because of that connection I had when I worked in Florida.
And what years were you kind of visiting Cuba back and forth?
So that was probably 2014. This project was started in 2014, but I started going to Cuba back in 2012. So I had a couple trips that I made back in 2012, but they were more, I'd say they're more like a kind of like setting myself still part of like a news photographer. I still had that mentality of like covering like something that was newsworthy, something that was of the moment that could be explained right away versus taking a longer approach to an idea or a larger project that would take more time. I was kind of going down there and giving myself assignments. And, it was good that I did because what ended up happening was this project. And I found out about this project on my final trip back in, I think, 2013. And that launched a whole new set of trips and applying for grants and really
Yeah.
like pouring everything I had into this.
So there was like a very key moment that shifted
Yeah.
your mind about how you moved into this larger project. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I don't speak fluent Spanish. I kind of stumble through it. When I was there, I needed a fixer, somebody who had a car, knew the area, could get me access to things I needed to, had connections, and would translate for me. So those kind of all those things go into one person who I basically spend all my time with. And so this person, I was at his house actually. They were cooking me dinner one night. They're showing me how to make beans and rice. And I remember we were sitting there, we were just hearing this like heavy bass thumping, this just kind of like, you know, EDM music. And I just thought it was so funny because, you know, the stereotype of Cuba is to hear salsa, or rumba, and, you know, these are the things that reached me being in the US. And hearing that, I was like, man, that is loud. Where is that coming from? And so I told them like we were going to go investigate, and we went out and I started looking around and found one of these big open plazas that they have in the city. And there was a huge stage set up. There was a DJ. There were, you know, the whole like laser light effect. And there were hundreds and hundreds of young Cubans out there just dancing, enjoying the moment. Like it was a different thing than I had seen so far in all my exploration. And so I went in and I started photographing it, and it kind of felt like photographing a concert, and it was interesting, but it wasn't really connecting. And I just kind of sat there and thought about it, and it just kind of dawned on me, like, this feels more like the US than anything else that I've seen here. And maybe I haven't explored enough to find that out. And it kind of evolved into this project of understanding that the youth culture was driving a new way of existing within Cuba that was kind of changing the narrative of the stereotype that we had really been really seen for the majority up to that point. I think we would often see this crumbling building, old car, you know, land lost in time. And here was this vibrant community that didn't kind of feel the burden of that history on their shoulders. And that's what I wanted to show. And so that kind of became the crux of this new thing. Is this project was about showing that individuality in a country that had been built on collectivism.
Right. And most of the, you know, sort of people that you're depicting in your photographs in this body of work, you know, I think you're exploring this sense of identity that was cultivated around the generation born in Cuba's special period, which is a term for the period of time, I believe, between 1991 and 2001. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say, like, I guess technically they say 1989. That's kind of when so I wanted to find people who were born from 1989 on, because that's when the USSR collapsed. And with that came all the support for Cuba, because at that moment they had propped Cuba up with money, energy, all kinds of different things. And so when they packed up and left shop, Cuba fell into you know, a crisis for a long time. People were going without food, people were going without electricity. Things were really dire there. There were a lot of malnourished people. It really left a mark on that next generation. And so the people that were growing up in that time have, you know, I've done a lot of interviews, and what I really hear is that moment changed a lot of perceptions on that system of government, right or wrong. It's not whether, we're not debating whether or not communism is an appropriate system of government. We're looking at specifically the government that was in place, functioning in Cuba at the time, and what people saw of that government and how their experiences with that changed the way that they interact now, and change the way that they view their own society now. And, you know, you have people, Laura, one of my good friends who was also joined us for the artist talk, you know, she had this experience in Cuba where when she was born in 1994, her mother, during her third trimester, had very little for nourishment, and would be basically drinking water with some sugar as kind of a nutritious thing for her child. And that, you know, she tells that story. She remembers being told that story when she was born, and she, you know, it has lived with her and has informed who she is now. So really the story goes into that, using that history to say, okay, now that they're in their 20s and early 30s, what does that look like? Like, what is that generation doing with that knowledge of what it was like when they were children?
Right. And I think that when you're told those stories repeatedly from a young age, it seeps into your consciousness, right? And so it very much becomes, it sounds like for Laura, a sense of her identity and perhaps her pursuit of, what could be perceived as extreme individualism is that sort of bucking against this necessity to satisfy the collective. And I think that
Yeah.
that comes out in many of your portraits of, the youths in Havana.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I perceive so many different sensory experiences in your work. The first thing that you speak about is music, and you've captured this sort of musical, rhythmic, like sensory, olfactory, this whole, immersive experience in just these, small body of photographs. It's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah. I think that there was like something in photography that I try to do is not capture the verb, but the adverb. And so it's not about the doing pictures. It's more about a feeling and an emotion. It's about quickly, or, it's the LYs. It's the
Right.
words that like really
Yeah.
like describe to you what's happening and give you a way in which things are happening. So when you combine that with music, when you combine it with fashion, when you combine it with lifestyle, I think it starts to bring about more different thematic points, which you can kind of extend as you're working on a story. Is you kind of build a central theme to it, and then you start to find out where those branches for that theme go, and you kind of follow each one until you feel like you followed it long enough, and then you kind of come back to the center and say, okay, well, what else is there? And so that's a lot of the work ends up doing that, which is kind of fans out into different areas, but within the same central theme.
So how is your process for working on a story, like as an assignment, through a publication, different than how you would pursue a project of your own initiation?
I think when working on assignment, personally, I'm given a lot of parameters with which to work. So it'll be a portrait of someone, and I don't sometimes get to choose the time of day because they have a schedule that I need to work within. They want it lit a certain way with different lights. Maybe they want gels. Maybe they want to evoke. They'll tell me the kinds of emotions. They'll kind of give me a mood board that kind of gives me a direction with which they want to see the picture. Sometimes I do get something where they say, do your thing. But oftentimes, I'll be sent a story ahead of time, which I read and kind of start to understand who it is I'm photographing or what situation I'm photographing, and kind of have to figure out from there how I'm going to approach that. Something like Havana Youth, it's a lot more, I'd say, stream of consciousness. It's a lot more, you could say, lyrical, because it's me out there just kind of being authentic to what happens in the moment and spending the time. It's not, a lot of the assignments that I have are one day. Maybe if I'm lucky, it'll be 4 days. This was, over the course of several years. So there's a different level of understanding. The more time you spend with someone, the more understanding you're going to have, the more in depth you can go, the more nuance you can show in the pictures. And so that's what it is. These larger projects, these personal projects that I do, are really built on time, really built on the understanding that I'm going to be spending time, not just being there for a few moments, but being there for the long haul, and developing real relationships, and not just kind of going there and, as it can happen sometimes, the artist uses the person who's the subject of the story and then leave and never have contact again. I maintained contact with almost everyone that I've photographed in Cuba, because I built in that time to develop a real friendship.
Right. And to that end, you were in Cuba during a very pivotal time in terms of the relationship of the United States to Cuba.
Yeah.
I think that maybe the travel limitations opened up in around 2020. When would that have
It was
happened?
about 2015 that they
2015.
opened up, because I remember the first trip that I took, I was still kind of working my way in through Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
I'd fly to Mexico, stay the night, and then I'd fly to Cuba. And then in Cuba, they don't stamp your passport because they didn't, they were kind of on your side. They didn't want the US to know that you had been to Cuba because it was still illegal to have done it at that time. And so I would come back and my passport would just say Mexico because that's where I would stay one night for. Then the Obama administration normalized a lot of relations, including travel, including specifically for journalists and artists and people like myself. So at that point, I was flying out of Miami on one of the shortest flights I've ever been on. It's literally like we're taking off, and then, now we're landing. And it was maybe 30 minutes. I mean, I don't think the flight ever actually gets up into where cruising altitude. It's just kind of up and down. And then and then I'm in Cuba, and then things changed. I mean, when I first went going through Mexico, they still had, there's the U.S. embassy, or the U.S. interest section is what they call it. They used to have a 20 something Cuban flags up, kind of facing the U.S. interest section, kind of defiantly. It's this very famous thing. And by the end of the time that I was there, all the flags were gone because they had normalized relations and everyone was trying to get along. So it kind of, I got to see a lot of development. Sadly, soon after the project was kind of done, things changed once again, as they are now, and now there's extremely limited, if any, travel to Cuba from the US.
Right. So how do you think that ebb and flow of the openness of travel between Cuba and the US has impacted the generation you've been documenting?
I think that generation is not going to be influenced by fluctuations like this. I think they have a sense of what they want to do, and they're not going to let a government kind of tell them that it's okay or not okay anymore. I think that we're kind of past that point. I think you see some similarities between here and there in terms of this next generation kind of deciding that it's not okay anymore, and kind of coming together in that way, and trying to bring about change through a very authentic process. And I think it might not be the same process in Cuba. They can't protest, but they do it in different ways. It's kind of like it's a revolution through fashion. It's a revolution through things. And we kind of might laugh at that because, thinking about a revolution through fashion kind of seems like, yeah, so what? Like, we all, around here, we all wear what we want to wear whenever we want to wear it. And there, it symbolized something completely different. For such a long time, they all had to wear the same thing, and you couldn't be outspoken, and you couldn't wear something that was so different than everyone else. You were the whole ethos of Cuba was that you were part of the larger machine. And so there wasn't this individual emphasis. And that is so changed now to where, Chanel is doing runway shows in Havana, and they're doing really big things there. And, one of the things that the fashion blogger that I made a portrait of said to me was like, dressing the way you want in Cuba is like a journalist writing an article against the government there.
Wow.
And if you know anything about it, writing an article against the government in Cuba can land you in prison. So just the fact of like being able to choose what you want to wear and dress how you want to dress, or wear your hair the way you want to, that's recent. I mean, generally speaking, that's not something that's been around for 50 years. That's something that's new.
Yeah. Greg, I don't know if we haven't done this before, so it's kind of a new thing, but
Yeah.
do you want to maybe pick up your iPad? And there's actually two portraits right behind you there on the pop-out wall that I think speak to what you're talking about.
We have the pop-out wall
Pompey.
here.
Yeah, these wonderful photos.
So these are two dancers. One is named Pompey, He is also a self-taught tailor. So he designs all his own clothes.
Yeah, that's his
And this is Rachel. And a lot of this is just to kind of say, like, you know, there are a lot of individual voices and there's a lot of individual fashion in the way people think and work. And we typically regard Cuba as a place that's like a land lost in time, a place that's, you know, a place that hasn't had like technology or been able to like, we you know, people have traveled there kind of looking at it as like this ancient place that you want to go see before it becomes, you know, there's a McDonald's and Starbucks on every corner. And it's so much more than that. And I think part of this was to kind of show that the evolution of that individuality coming out of that young generation that they wanted people to see too, that they had said to me, like, you know, sometimes we feel like we're in a fishbowl because no one shows this part of us. They show the old buildings and they show the classic cars, but no one shows this. And I tell you, like, there were some places I would go in Cuba and be around everyone, and it was just like being in the United States in Miami. I mean, they're just, you couldn't see the difference. But if you go look up pictures of Cuba right now, you're gonna see a bunch of old buildings in a very stylized, you know, colonialist Spanish way. And you're gonna see the people smoking the big cigars, and you're gonna see the classic cars and all this stuff. And that's all true. It's not to say that that stuff isn't there, but it's just that this project was about kind of showing the everything else. It's not showing Manhattan, it's showing the entire side of Brooklyn that you don't see. You know, it's showing more. It's trying to open up everything to say that there's more there than just what's been shown so far.
So as an artist, when you're thinking about a body of work and exhibiting, what are you thinking about in terms of your audience and what you want them to take away from this body of work?
You know, for this, it was, what struck me was that even in my travels there at the beginning, I didn't see the things that were happening. And I realized that this is something that is pretty typical. Sometimes you can go somewhere and not like really get into the streets. You see the hotel, you see the areas that, you know, you're expected to see, the tourist areas, but you don't get to see like what life is like. And with Cuba, I think that was especially true. And I think there was this mysteriousness about Cuba. And the more involved I got with, you know, everyone there, the more I realized that there, you know, I needed to kind of break that down. And so, you know, the pictures deal with people like accessing internet or enjoying their you know, hanging out on you know, a corner, or, you know, sitting by the seaside and you know, partying all night. And I think these are all these very, to us, photographing that here would be like, yeah, so what? We all know we do that.
Right.
But there, it's a big deal. And so photographing it there made it a connection to here, to say like, look, like, it's easy to make this place feel not normal and different and lost in time. And, you know, they basically went from landlines to iPhones. I mean, there's a huge technological leap, and you can't discount that. But at the same time, this generation has adopted these technologies and different cultural aspects that they've kind of reached out to their European and US counterparts, and it really changed Cuba. And I wanted to make sure that that was seen, so that it's not this fishbowl anymore. You don't go there and you look at everyone like you're otherizing them. I think that's a part of the problem that comes about by only showing these like extravagant things like the old cars and crumbling buildings. And I want to just make it feel like a place where there are people, you know, just living and experiencing life in a new way. And this generation that's changing it, how Cuba is even seen.
Yeah, and actually we've got a great question from Ayana who asks, is their internet access monitored or limited?
So that's been changing. When I first got there, there were certain sites you couldn't go to, like Google wasn't allowed. I tried to check my Gmail when I was there and I couldn't because anything out of there was bad. The difference being that in the tourist hotels, you could access that, but there would be security that kept Cubans out of the hotels so that they couldn't access the same internet.
Wow.
So you would see Cubans kind of mingling about outside the hotels. The way that they had internet was you would buy like a little paper card that gave you like a username and password, and that would get you 2 hours, and you'd pay about $2.50 for 2 hours. And this comes from a place where people are generally making $20 a month. So you can imagine that, they have internet, but how many can access it? How many can be on the internet? So then you start to see the cultural divide and who has money and who doesn't in Cuba. So yeah, there were some sites that you couldn't get onto, but by the time it was 2017 or so, regularly you could go on any news site, you can go basically on anything. The really interesting part was it wasn't the internet that was driving a lot of the information in Cuba. There was somebody or some people, and they're still unknown because they would be arrested and thrown in jail if they knew who they were. They have a really fast internet connection somewhere. And they download all the telenovelas, NFL games, TV shows, movies that are out in theaters now, everything. And it's called paquete. And the packet is something that gets delivered on a flash drive, home to home. So somebody downloads all the new stuff. They bring it around, they give it to you, you pay a monthly fee for it. And I think you get it once a week. You plug it into your computer, you download everything off of it, you give the flash drive back. They just stand outside your door. You give the flash drive back, they take it to the next house. They know they've got a list of all the subscribers. And so that is how a lot of them were getting their information. Now the Cuban government knows about this, but since they don't have any propaganda on there, as the Cuban government calls it, there's no organizing to overthrow the government. There's no anti-government material on there. It's the New York Times or CNN or an NFL game. These aren't things that they're opposed to, so they allow it to go on. So it's a saying that the Cubans use. It's a gray area. It's not legal, but it's not illegal. And this is where Cubans are making money and doing things and kind of creating that new life. But really, they've created digital magazines, fashion magazines. It's like the Vogue of Cuba. It is only delivered through the packet. That is where you see it.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting thing where it's, somebody has a really good internet connection because they're downloading all this stuff. I remember walking into a house one time and I walked in and they were playing a movie that was currently in theaters in the US. And I was like, how do you have that on it's like an HD version on their TV. And I was like, how does that get in here? Well, somebody's got an internet connection to get it.
Well, a great follow-up question to this is from Nayla. I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. Then why wouldn't the government just supply those things so people didn't have to do it illegally? Is the question.
I don't think the government feels like a responsibility to supply that. I think now they actually have internet on their phones on a rolling basis, so they can pay for it like monthly, and they'll get a basic amount of internet on their phones. I think Cuba wants to control the information as best they can. They also want people to, like the idea is though, if the Cuban government shuts the packet down, then you start to have people that are angry, they'll find a new way to get that information. So it's kind of like, it's about the government knowing the leaks that are there, rather than trying to plug them and have new leaks come out. They can monitor the one that's there. They can kind of get their security and information to kind of figure out, okay, what's in it this time. And if something comes in that's not appropriate, then they'll shut it down. But at least now it's kind of like the people are kind of okay with it and the government kind of lets it slide. That way people don't get angry or kind of start to feel like, it's like a sense of having freedom, but not really having it. It's a controlled freedom that they're being given.
Right. We were kind of talking about this just before we started our Zoom. Actually, the president of the university, Dr. Becerra, was here and we were kind of chatting. She's from Cuba originally. And we were talking about this sense of controlled freedom where the government essentially gives the people just enough freedom to feel like they don't need to ask for more in a strange way. And your experience with May Day, I think it was what you
Yeah.
talked about, was really interesting. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so May Day is kind of like the day that was for the workers, and it's held around the world the 1st of May, and in Cuba it's a little different because it ends up being a parade that everyone is in. And what you do is you march through the streets. There's no one lining the streets to watch the parade. You are the parade. Everyone is the parade. And what you do is you march by into the center of Havana where all the huge monuments are of all the great leaders and everything. And Castro or, Raul Castro was there the day that I did it. And everyone waves to him and he waves back and he's got all the military generals up there and everyone, people have signs for their new restaurant. And there's some advertising happening. There's some people are finding ways to like kind of get their own messaging out there. But the interesting part of it is that no one stays home. Every block has somebody that is working with the government to make sure that everyone comes out of their home that morning to make sure they are in the parade to march. So you don't want to get caught at home because you could end up in jail. So whether you want to participate or not, you're in the parade. So the entire city of Havana, unless you have a medical reason or something else, are involved in doing this long march through the streets. And it's kind of like, it feels like a party and it doesn't feel as like an authoritative, requirement, but it kind of is. And the seriousness with which people make sure that they're up and out the door, I think it's something like 6 a.m. Everyone's already preparing for it. It's a fascinating thing because it's supposed to be a parade for the workers, but it ends up being kind of like a parade to give thanks to their leader.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I just found that so fascinating. How that whole system works.
Yeah, there's so many secret police there that there's a lot of mind games that happen in Cuba. There's a lot of the police monitor things on a very secret level that a lot of Cubans themselves don't realize they're being watched when they are. They're very paranoid. They know something's always going on, and they tend to like not trust anyone because there's always these games being played. So it's sometimes very difficult. Like anytime somebody opens up to you about, you could sit down with someone and say like, hey, what do you think about the Cuban government? And they kind of seem way too open about, being critical of the government. You start to sit back and be like, are you trying to entice me to say something bad about the government too? Because you want somebody to see if I'm gonna say something mean and then get arrested, or, there's this whole kind of dynamic that happens. So a lot of people keep that stuff to themselves.
Right. And for you, there's a certain amount of risk involved in just taking these photographs. And you've mentioned to me that you kind of had to keep a low profile in terms of even the equipment that you brought into Cuba to photograph.
Yeah, I was warned before going that I probably would be watched. I kind of didn't, you hear it and you're like, oh, you're kind of being like, this is a bit dramatic. And then the first time I went, I'm standing in line to get through customs, and somebody from the Cuban government comes over and pulls me out of line. And it's just, you got these long lines to get through customs, and somebody comes directly over to me without, not like looking through, just comes straight to me and says, come with me. And I'm going, oh boy, this is happening before I even get anything started. And, I see the piece of paper that he has, and he's got my full name. He's got it says journalist on it. And I'm looking at it like, how does he have all this information? He's got enough information to recognize me, to have my name,
Right.
to see me as a journalist. And so he started asking me questions about what I was doing there, what I intended to do with my camera. And it was interesting. So I told him, I kept it very general. I just said, look, like I'm here to photograph people and places. and different scenes in Cuba, which none of that's untrue.
Right.
And I said, look, I've got an artist grant. I'm an artist, so that's what I'm doing. And so he said, well, let me see your camera. And so this is when, you know, my decision to be very low profile came into play. I have a little Sony camera that doesn't look much more than a point and shoot. And so when he sees that, instead of a big DSLR with all the lenses and everything,
Right.
he goes, it fit in a little bag like this that I could carry around all day. And he was just kind of like, okay, well, enjoy your stay. You're free to go. Now, do I think that somebody was probably watching me? Yeah, I probably had tabs kept on me, but I didn't stay in the government hotels. I stayed in an Airbnb. So I kind of felt like I had a little bit more anonymity, but to what extent I was being followed, I don't know. They're very good at it. And I just kind of felt like, as long as I didn't participate any sort of disseminating of like, you know, propaganda against the government, I was probably going to be fine.
Yeah, well, this is a great segue to Nikisha's question. She says, this reminds me a lot of what the artist Ai Weiwei experienced in China. What is life like for artists who want to speak out against the government?
That's really interesting. Considering Castro spent a lot of time studying some of the policies and some of the methods that China had put in place, it's not so unexpected to hear that there's a similarity. I read something of that. Castro had studied Chinese government, the way that they implemented their policies in the exact same way, and studied them to, it was this idea of giving a little to appease the people, but not so much that they thought that the government was ever going to change. So there was this kind of careful balance that Castro had studied. For people that are trying, social media has been great, but as I don't, and you can go back and watch, but Laura talked about this. This is something that Cubans right now are dealing with, is trying to be able to voice this stuff on social media, but also being monitored by the Cuban government, because this is the new frontier. And so this is where that goes. You'll see artists trying to work within the framework. The biggest club / exhibition space in Havana right now is owned by a very famous Cuban artist who worked with the government to open the facility. Oh. So there's this sense of working within the space that you've been given to kind of get your message out. I think a lot of it comes out when Cubans leave Cuba, because I think there is inherently issues of what happens when the Cuban government finds out what you're doing. I'll say this, I'll show you one more here. This artist, she is, the way she does her artwork is that she will find propaganda from the Cuban government that's been spray painted on the walls. Like, they don't have any advertising in Cuba. It's all just government messages. So on these concrete walls, they'll have, all these kind of symbolic things painted or statements made, from Castro or Che or whoever. And what she does is she uses, and she wouldn't tell me exactly what it was, but she uses this thing where she will cover it in a liquid material, tape something over it, and then the next day be able to peel off the spray paint and the first layer of concrete, and then uses that as her base layer to create art. This is very illegal.
Yeah.
So she does it under the cover of night, or does it in a way that she won't get caught. But it's really interesting because she has sold some of it to Putin. She has sold some of it to other leaders. She's very famous. And so there's this weird cat and mouse game that happens where if she does get caught, she'll be thrown in jail, no questions asked, because, she's defacing, these very symbolic messages from the government. But yeah, she's got to avoid that. But at the same time, she's becoming very famous for doing so.
There are lots of questions in the chat kind of pertaining to the repercussions of something like this if she were to get caught. So I'm going to try to kind of lump these together. how long would you have to spend in jail if you were caught? Um, do you think they'd ever let you out if you were caught? Um,
If
would
me
there be
personally, or
an artist,
oh, an
let's say,
artist?
or would there be another form of punishment rather than jail? And would this be different if you were a foreigner versus Cuban?
Very different from foreigner versus Cuban. I mean, you'll see, like, you can see in Cuba now, and it's weird. It's kind of weird to even say this, but like, I found that Cuba was probably the safest place that I've ever been. It's a
Hmm.
place that you can walk around at 4 a.m. down the worst street and not be hassled by a single person or not fear anything, right? Like, there's just no, crime is essentially nothing. There's very, very little crime because Cubans know that there are very big repercussions for anything that, I mean, there was I talked to a taxi driver that said one time that he, didn't obey like a stop sign, and he ended up in jail for it for months. This is, I mean, there's no like traffic ticket. There's no, this kind of stuff,
Right.
you get a warning or whatever, like they don't hesitate to throw you in jail. And these jails are not places you want to go,
And there's no
you
stated
know?
amount of time that you're there. It's just
Yeah, there's, yeah,
whenever
this is the
you go.
thing. There's not they don't have a court system like we do where it's, this, okay, the precedent is you go to jail for X amount of time for doing this. It's just kind of, they do it based on the severity, and they have done a job on the psyche of the people there
Yeah.
that fear going into jail, so much so that they obey every single letter of the law that could land them in jail. you know um, they have found ways to get around a lot of these things.
Hmm.
So there's a kind of balance there, but in terms of like crime, it's minuscule.
Yeah. Well, this is a very good question. I'm not sure that either of us will know the answer, but how is the woman who's an artist in the photograph you just showed us selling her art to Putin? And if she gets in trouble, does Putin then have the power to sort of save her from the circumstances that befall her in
I
Cuba?
don't. I mean, I guess she could make a personal plea, but I don't know. I don't know if he would spend time dealing with that. He's doing whatever else that he does.
Riding
I
horses or
think
whatever.
that, yeah. I mean, she probably is nothing to him. I think he just, there's, Russia and Cuba and China all have a very close relationship
Yeah.
based on their idea of what government should be. A lot of state-controlled businesses, a lot of, being able to go in and do whatever you want, whenever you want. Speaking of the government. Um, so I know the reason that she has a connection with Putin is because her background is part Russian. And
Mm.
so her name is Veronica Guerra, and I think it's Veronica with a K. So you can look her up. I think she's got a decent online presence, and you can see some of her artwork. But I remember, sitting there talking to her because she has been putting out some of this stuff, and there's a lot of communist messaging in them. The communist community then embraced it. It's not as though she was against the system of government. I think she was just doing something illegal to get those items to use in her artwork. So it was more about the method by which she was getting the art versus actually the art itself.
Yeah. Um, okay, we've got more questions. This is
Yeah.
great. You guys are fantastic. Creativity and critical thinking, as you talk, seemingly are vital resources in how Cuban people may go against the government and protest. Can you elaborate how young artists you met use their creativity in critical or even covert ways to express their political opinion against oppression? Yeah. Mhm.
So you'll see a lot of it is stuff that when we see it, we don't think anything of it. It's kind of like what I was saying before. Fashion.
Right.
Fashion is a great example of this. It's being able to choose something and wear something that might poke fun at the government. There was a good comedy audio broadcast that had come out that made fun of Castro, and it used his voice, and it was a whole scene that was playing out that just kind of made fun of the idea of the communist state, and how ridiculous it was, and how Castro couldn't take a joke. And so you had two actors playing the roles, and they went through this whole dialogue, and it was, you know, it's one of those things where it's a little bit silly, it's a little bit like a caricature, but at the same time, like, it was sending a more thoughtful message that this is how people were feeling about things. And so you end up seeing, like, you don't see a lot of protest art there. You don't. It's happening in a very different way. And I think people are working within the structure that they're being given, this gray area that I talked about, to get their art out there without going so far to offend the government. And like I said, I think the only way that you'll see that happen is when somebody leaves the country and is living somewhere else, and then can create art that talks about, you know, the problems that are happening in Cuba. Because it's still, while there's a lot of things that have opened up to being owned personally, the government still owns basically everything, and will exercise the right to own something if they see that it's becoming a problem. So it's, again, like, they kind of have to work within that boundary. And so you don't see it until somebody leaves Cuba and it can freely express themselves.
It's been interesting. So just to give you guys a little bit of context, Greg's exhibition was originally slated for March, and then of course the world changed, and we delayed it until now. But there was a DJ duo, a female DJ duo called Pausa, that so very kindly created a playlist for us to share with our community that was inclusive of, you know, very traditional Cuban music, but also kind of brought it up to today. And while they've continued to add to this playlist, right? So now it's like very dancey, kind of like almost EDM style music from all over the world, but also in Cuba. And I was sitting there listening to the updated playlist this morning, and I thought, wow, like there's a lot of messaging in here that, like, I'm not sure that the Cuban government would really be down with, you know? So there are these avenues for protest, in a sense, that come through in music and in art and dress and fashion, that, you know, it's like the only way to kind of get the message out are these
but it's interesting because it's still so tightly controlled, though.
Right.
So for a while, like, you know, reggaeton is huge there. You'll hear reggaeton all night, every night. And at one point, Castro kind of shut it down because of the foul language, or the language that wasn't kind to women, because there's a lot of misogynistic lyrics within most music, never mind reggaeton. Right. So he would hear the music and then basically put out a law that said, like, you can't do reggaeton if you're going to have these lyrics in it. So all of a sudden there was this wave of really, really clean reggaeton. Wow. You know, it talked about like homework, and, you know, it was just this very different thing that became kind of normal. I hung out with a couple different reggaeton groups, and they were like, oh yeah, no, we can't talk about those things because, you know, the government has said we can't curse, they didn't like the language being used, they didn't like the themes, so they all had to change it. And then I started watching some of the music videos that were created, and it was very like 90s alternative music, where it was just kind of like this, like, I'm sitting in a classroom, like, oh, I just dream to be outside running around. And it was, you know, it's just strange for reggaeton to be that way. But I think since Raul Castro has now been gone off the seat of the power, it's kind of changed again, where people are able to do more and more. But yeah, it's just like, it's a weird balance. So there has been such tight control for such a long time that it's hard for us to fathom there not being so much protest art. But they're really, you know, if you put protest art out there, somebody's going to talk to someone, and somebody will eventually find you, and you don't want to end up in prison. So it exists, but it's very, very, very underground, which means there's not actually a lot of people that get to see it.
Yeah, I think sort of going back to Nikisha's question about how, how do you exist as an artist? It's just, it's constantly walking the line. You
Yeah,
kind of have to keep a foot in both worlds to exist.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean,
Um,
art exists. It's really interesting that, the club that they have, that's also it's 2 floors. Like the first floor is 2 different dance floors. One will be like kind of pop music, another one will be EDM. And
yeah.
then the next floor up is kind of a performance stage where people make like kind of like art films about different things. And then the floor above that is exhibition space. And this is where tourists and locals are going all the time. I mean, this is the kind of place where you line up at 9 o'clock and you get in at 1 a.m. So it's a very popular spot, and they bring in major artists like Usher perform there,
Oh,
ZZ Top perform there. Like all the American artists that end up in Cuba tend to end up on stage there. So it
yeah.
just kind of becomes like a place where a lot of the international acts show up.
Yeah. Another great question from Ayana. What is your favorite picture in the collection?
Uh, Favorite picture, killing me.
Tough one.
I mean, it really is. It's hard to come up with a favorite picture. I think probably the one that's most famous is the one that's of the Cubans along the Malecon with
Mm,
the one pink car driving through. I think that's the one that has, you know, made the rounds the most and has, kind of been the jumping off point for this work.
could you
Because I think for me, yeah, I was gonna say, I was like,
could you take us
for
out?
me, yeah. So what we're gonna do is, let's see. So this is the famous Malecon. This is where basically the Cubans who, aren't able to get into the club, aren't able to pay the cover fee, go, and there's music and drinking and partying, and it starts Friday and Saturday, and it goes until early the next morning. I mean, I'm talking like 7, 8 a.m. the
Oh my
next
gosh.
day. Yeah,
That's my
there's so many
bedtime.
times I'd be like, all right, I'm calling it. It's 3 a.m. I'm going to sleep. And then I'd wake up and walk down there in the morning, and there are still people out there from the night before, like kind of just carrying on, like those stragglers. So it's a spot for the young kids, and it kind of just, for me, there was just so much to it with the style of dress. And for Cubans, like, the way they plan everything for their Friday and Saturday nights. They get their best outfits together. The way that they get fashion is really interesting. There's people that come by with clothing and different things that they'll sell out of a bag that has been imported, through a relative that has come into the country, and brought stuff from Europe or the US, and they'll load it up and bring it to Cuba and then sell it for a decent markup. So that's how people get Nike and Adidas and all the brands that are popular here are popular there in the same way, except they're even more exclusive.
Another question from Jama. What picture touched you the most? Slightly.
I think, I don't know. I'd say probably the one of Pompey. I'll take you over to this one too. It's basically, he's a self-taught tailor. Um, he's in his
Yeah.
home right here, and he's actually making outfits. He's making the dance outfits for his dance troupe. He also is a break dancer, and so he's a dancer, self-taught tailor. He's kind of the quintessential person that I was kind of telling the story about, because he has every opportunity to leave Cuba. He has relatives that are in Canada and Germany. He could leave if he wanted to. But he's of this generation that wants to stay and see where things go and make Cuba into the place they want. I think he's symbolic of a lot of different young Cubans right now. And that's not to say that's all Cubans. It's just people like him. You're starting to see, instead of waves and waves of Cubans leaving constantly, I think you're starting to see Cubans wanting to stay and wanting to be a part of the next generation and the next government and the next society that's there. I just think that there's a lot of change happening, and the Cubans see it and they want to have a hand in it.
Yeah. Jameis says it's like they want to be a part of change, which I think is dead on. Yeah.
I think there's so many parallels right now to what's happening here, and I think it's really important. You know, I think that there's a feeling that you know, the notion of governance informing the identity of the people. I mean, I would imagine that looking back 20 years from now, we're all going to be able to say how this period of time changed us. And it changed the way we viewed certain things, whether it be government or whether it be the way that we interact with people, or the way that we you know, all the issues that are being brought up right now that are so important. I think that comes about because of the conditions, the system of government that's in place, the system of policing that's in place. And I think those things are different, but in a way the same in Cuba, to where when they went through that special period, when they didn't have anything, when they were hungry, when they didn't have power, that affected how they grew up, and that informed who they are now and the way that they look at that government now. Again, it's kind of not a debate about whether or not communism works. It's specifically to their personal experience with that system of government and how they treat things now. There's a reliance on material goods now.
Yeah.
People want to get status. People want to buy new clothes and have iPhones and do all these things. And it's not surprising that they want that, because they were without it for so long. It seems natural when you finally have access to these things is to try and have them.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just so pleased at how inquisitive everybody is. We've got so many great questions still to get to. Nikisha, I just want to be respectful of your time. Do we have time to get through a few more questions, or? Yeah.
Yeah, we can get through. I see going back to 407, Lukuye has a question.
Yeah. All right. Lukuye asked a great question. Did you do any work with the African and Cuban diaspora movement? Like spelled like ache, but could be pronounced a different way.
No, you know, there's a lot of great work being done on that stuff. I was focusing mainly on the young Cubans within Havana that kind of formed this. I want to say, like, they're kind of a little bit more of some of the privileged ones, and I wanted to contrast that with things like the Malecón, where there were people who didn't have as much money, because essentially, like, you know, for a long time there was this notion that all Cubans were equal within communism, and such has changed now that you're starting to see that class separation,
Yeah,
and you will see it divided.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You will see it divided along racial lines as well.
Yeah. Jonathan asks, what is the most complicated picture to take?
You know, I used to say that it was like a picture that, I mean, it involves trust. I mean, that's what it comes down to. We're talking a lot these days about consent in photography. And I only work based on that. I don't, the kind of street photography is not the kind of thing that I do. I work to develop really strong relationships with people, so that when I am taking pictures, this is something that they want me to be a part of, and that they know that I understand the story that I'm trying to tell. So it's really about, the hardest pictures are the ones that take time to develop that trust, because I need to put in the effort to show them that I'm there for the right reasons, and not for my own personal success. It's more for the story.
Is there a particular one in this show that encapsulates that concept?
I would say maybe it was probably the underground party. The underground party is this. This was a party that only came about, you only got to go to it through word of mouth, which means you had to have the trust of someone that say like, okay, party. And EDM party. You know, again, it's not like something that they put a Facebook invite on and or send it out or start messaging people through Instagram or whatever. This was something that was done only through word of mouth, and it was because I had the trust of the people that I was hanging out with that they then said, like, they didn't have to say, hey, why don't you come to this party with us? It's like this underground party that you know, is very like word of mouth. They could have just been like, hey, you know, we're not coming out tonight or whatever, and gone to the party, but instead they allowed me to be a part of that. And so that to me symbolizes the, you know, the kind of being able to develop a relationship and, you know, be a part of something for long enough that people start to trust you and understand that you're going to, you know, tell the story the way that you say you are.
From Arundhati, what is school like from teenage Cubans? For teenage Cubans?
School is, I mean, they are, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but they have a very specific history that they are taught from a very early age. And my conversation with Laura during the artist talk kind of, she explained that a little bit, where, you know, it is pounded into them the wrongs that the U.S. government has done to the nation of Cuba, and they grew up learning this, and it's every year, it's every time, and schooling is taken very seriously. There are no, you don't have dropouts, you don't have anyone skipping school. School is, you know, you wear the uniform and you go to school, and you know, what's sad is that, you know, there's a lot of Cubans that go through school and college and end up being an engineer and can't make more than $20 a month. But if you want to be a taxi driver, you can be a taxi driver and make a lot of money. I mean, taxi drivers can be some of the richest Cubans in the country because they have access to a car,
Yeah.
and they're getting paid all day long by others. And so it's a strange society in which, you know, when you have a job that is considered, you know, high expertise, you don't make much.
Yeah. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here from Bailey and Brandon. How long was the process of taking these pictures? And when it comes to taking them, do you prefer film or digital?
So the process took, I'd say I was there from, I think I started the story in 2014 and then finally finished it in 2018 after National Geographic sent me back to do something specifically on Cubans and the internet. So I would say it wrapped up around 2018. And I prefer digital, and it's for a very, I don't know, lazy reason. I hate the idea of sitting and scanning film. I hate the idea of once I've scanned the film, now I have to pour over it with a fine-tooth comb, trying to get all the dust off of it. I have friends that shoot film, and I will talk to them and they will say, well, I spent the last 6 hours like getting dust off a scanned negative. And I think, but you don't have to.
Yeah.
So like, I get it. I get the process of film. I love the way film looks. I'm all digital. I use a medium format digital now. So I'm very happy with the system. The cameras are so much lighter. I don't have to worry about airport x-rays destroying the film.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, there's just so many advantages to it. Being able to, you know, send from the camera to the phone, and being able to, one of the great things now is being able to share the pictures with people that I photograph immediately. And so I'll make a portrait, and then, you know, the next day we in Cuba, since you didn't have internet and everywhere, the iPhone was kind of cool because you could airdrop it. And so we would just be airdropping photos to each other, and it worked out really well. And once again, like, you know, they don't often have somebody coming and photographing them and doing, you know, hanging out with them and photographing them all day long and then sending them cool pictures, so that it helps, you know. It
Yeah.
helps facilitate better relationships.
Were there any Cubans you came across that were resistant to interact with an American artist?
Oh,
You visited
totally.
Aaron
100%.
Dempsey? Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. There are people who, you know, for whatever personal preference didn't feel like participating. And that's, I never want to feel like I'm coercing somebody into being a part of the story. That, like, what's the point?
Yeah.
Um, like if somebody doesn't want to be a part of it, then that's their prerogative. And I hold nothing against them for that. That's who they are. That's fine. The story can be made with people who are willing to be a part of it. And that's great. You know, I being at a newspaper, there was always this sense of like trying to convince someone to be a part of a story. And I always hated that part of it. I
Mm,
thought that, you know, if I can just explain the story to them and they can make an informed decision, then that's all I can do.
yeah.
At the newspaper, there was always this sense of like, you know, if I'd come back from an assignment, I'd say, well, these people didn't want to be photographed. They'd be like, well, did you tell them, like, did you
Yeah.
try and use this method or did you try and make it? And I just always felt uncomfortable doing that because it felt like I'm trying to, this doesn't feel natural anymore. Like once the person, you know, maybe the person agrees and then it's awkward the whole time, or, you know, like,
Yeah. You have to
I'd
maintain
rather,
integrity in your work. Yeah.
yeah. And I'd rather say, you know what, fine. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll say, you know what, I never usually go in with the camera up taking pictures. I always start with conversation. But sometimes I would go, you know what, maybe I haven't spent long enough time with this person. And I would spend more time, camera in the bag, just getting to know them. And you know, it's hanging out, it's building a relationship.
Yeah.
And then maybe they'd be like, after a while, they'd say, okay, you know what, like, you seem pretty cool. Like we can do this, you know, like it's without me pushing them, without me being like, well, what about now? Are you cool now? Is it okay now? But just, no. It's just like, hey, you know, like I want to get to know people. I want to understand the story. Even if I don't photograph you, you have something interesting to say and I can use that to inform the pictures that I do make.
So from Emmett, what was the most impactful part of creating the exhibition?
You know, so much now is wrapped up in a digital space where we're looking at our phones on a small screen that for me, when having these images printed at, you know, 30 inches by 40 inches, this is kind of the way that I meant them to be seen. So being able to see that for the first time, because I don't normally print my work unless it's for a purpose, because it's just expensive and I don't have space where I live to do that. This is, you know, this is wonderful to be able to like kind of sit back and stare at it at a large size, to be able to pick up all the details, because, you know, it's not, you know, it's funny because some of the times I go on Instagram and I'll post one of these pictures that kind of is far back and the people are small, and, you know, it's a picture that's meant to be studied, you know, in a big way, and it ended up on Instagram and you don't get many likes on it because people can't really see it. It doesn't jump off the screen.
Yeah.
And I get it. There's a kind of picture that works better for Instagram, and some of the work that I do isn't made for that. And so when I see it in print, that just makes it for me. And that's really, it's so fulfilling, because it feels like, you know, once it gets out into this physical way, this print, that it like is in its like, you know, authentic form.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great answer. From Juanita, how do you think you have impacted these young adults by representing them in your work, and how do you think they would react to your art? And I think they
No,
have
that's it.
reacted to it.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. Yeah, I mean, again, like I have a friendship with a lot of the Cubans that I photographed, and I keep in touch with them. And, you know, even brought, you know, Laura, who is a good friend of mine, who I worked with for a long time there. She came on and we kind of asked that question. Um, and she said, you know, I wasn't really enlightened by anything, but
Yeah.
he just had his finger on the pulse of something that wasn't being shown. And I think that to me meant everything, because it's, you know, so many times I would hear, not to bring up the fishbowl analogy again, but that's kind of the way they looked at it. It's like they felt like they were in a zoo and they were tourists that would come there and stare at them and be like, ooh, you're
Yeah.
Cuban, how exotic. And they didn't feel like that. They hated that perception. They hated that idea. And so to kind of show situations that are more universal and that don't treat them that way, I think, you know, every time I would kind of show them the pictures and say, okay, here's what I'm looking at, here's what I'm expressing, like, how do you think? Because I you know, they were going to be the toughest critics. And to hear that kind of support from them to say, like, no, you've nailed this. This is exactly what it's like. Like, this captures, this feels like what it's like in Cuba from our perspective. That's what I wanted to hear. That's the goal of that. Because then when I'm showing it to other audiences, I can feel confident that what I'm showing contains the kind of view that the young Cubans have, and that I'm just kind of a part of that, kind of being able to bridge that gap.
Yeah, I love that. 2 questions from Kelly. What was your first reaction when you saw your work hanging on a wall? And is there a specific person that inspired you to be where you are today?
Great questions. Seeing it on a wall, it's always, I mean, I kind of just touched on it a little bit, but seeing it on a wall is an extraordinary feeling. You know, when I always say, like, when you have a project, like, you have to envision where you think that project is going to fit, whether it's going to be a book or an exhibition or published online. There are different ways that work needs to be seen in each venue. Like I said, a big picture like this doesn't necessarily work on Instagram sometimes, but it works in an exhibition. So seeing that here, like seeing those pictures that were meant for this purpose, I don't know. I feel like it's like, it's finally come full circle, and it's finally like able to, you know, be in the place that I intended it to be. So there's a sense of accomplishment with that. And I'm really, really happy with how this all turned out, and kind of being able to piece together with Caitlin, like the relationships of the pictures, so that, you know, understanding that, you know, in a book, you're looking at pages and how they relate to each other, but in a space like this, you're looking across the way and seeing not only how the pictures work next to each other, but how do they relate to pictures across the way. So it brings in a whole different dimension. I love being a part of that.
Me too. That was great.
Yeah. Well, talking about someone who like got me to where I am today, there was where I grew up, there was a professor at the University of Rhode Island that I knew when I was young, because my father was friends with her. They both worked at the university together. She kind of had this whole notion. She had in her office a big cardboard cutout of from the painting The Scream, as well as a cardboard cutout of Captain Spock. And she said this was her balance in life. It was this, you know, chaos and control. And she always loved to talk about those two things, and how like life is about keeping the balance between those two things and not kind of going from one to the other. And that really stuck with me at that age. I think I was in junior high when we talked through that, but I think that was a really pivotal moment where that's something that I keep in mind a lot. And kind of the way that she thought about things always was really different and inspiring. And it was good to be able to have those kind of conversations as a young person, that, you know, I was able to kind of feel like I was, you know, becoming more of the person that I wanted to be through that, and understanding more about life through that. And I thought that was super helpful. So I always like think back to that moment when I think about like how far I've come, because she was also the one that nominated me for that trip to study under the National Geographic photographers. So she was very instrumental in getting me to that place where I started to really kind of understand the craft.
Yeah, mentors are so important in life and in your professional journey, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this has just been the most fabulous conversation. I can't thank you guys enough for joining us. Greg, thank you.
No, thank you for all the questions. These were great. These were really insightful questions.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait till we can all be in one place and have all of you to the gallery to celebrate. I mean, this is, I'm just so thrilled. So thank you all for being with us today. Nikisha, thank you for bringing your class. And yes, please take the floor for an announcement.
Thank you so much, Caitlin and Greg, for taking time. I'm sure that the students will remember this for a really long time. This was, you imparted just great wisdom. Thank you so much.